All right, everyone, welcome to Fiveable and welcome to our weekly current events, COVID-19 and election 2020 update. So I'm Akash.
And I'm Fatma.
And let's get started. So as always, remember to follow Fiveable on all of our social media platforms on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So Brandon runs the TikTok. So be sure to give him a follow. It's the same handle on all of our social media platforms. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. In this stream, we're going to be talking a little bit about COVID-19, some current events, and then we're going to do a 2020 election update. It's going to be pretty short just because we know you guys have other streams to get to, or you have, review to do for your actual exam. So we want to give you some context, but not overwhelm you too much right before your exams. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the COVID-19 update and the numbers. So worldwide, we've now surpassed 4.1 million cases, and there's been over 285,000 deaths. That was updated probably like 2 hours ago. In terms of just the United States, we've surpassed 1.3 million cases, and we are over 81,000 deaths. So in terms of those deaths specifically, I think 7,000 nursing homes, like those facilities, have experienced either cases or deaths. In terms of state by state breakdown, the top five have stayed the same for the past 2 or 3 weeks. So New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and then Illinois and California. New York, as you can see, is like a pretty big chunk of the cases in the United States. So New York has 335,000 cases and 21,000 deaths. All right, so on this next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the global reaction to COVID-19 within the past week and really within the past few days. In Turkey, they just implemented a 4-day curfew. They combined a weekend and a public holiday that was like already existing from May 16th through May 19th, and that's kind of their plan to minimize the cases and community spread. The World Health Organization has said that there was a new surge in cases in countries where the stay-at-home order was lifted. So several countries have kind of taken action to do that, and wherever those stay-at-home measures have been lifted, they have seen an increase in cases. Additionally, the United Kingdom has begun, or will begin, I believe, on Wednesday, a 3-step recovery plan. So the first plan, or the first step in that 3-step plan, is going to be letting people go outside for leisure and parks and recreation, so opening that stuff up, and then allowing people to meet others who aren't in their immediate household, who they haven't been in contact with. Additionally, some countries are opening schools. So Canada is reopening schools for some students in kindergarten through 6th grade. And Quebec is one of the first areas in all of North America that is opening some schools. And then I believe France is also opening some schools after 2 months of them being on lockdown. So they had been on a really strict lockdown. And shops will now reopen, and then schools are going to open for primary grades, so elementary schools. And those classes are going to be limited to 15 students. In Italy, they've basically said that the responsibility to whether there should be a stay-at-home order or not, that's going to be left up to the regional government. So again, if you're an AP Gov, an example of that in the United States, if something like that happened, would be federalism, right? So this shows the balance between the federal government and the state government or the local governments. So here, the federal government of Italy, so the national government, has decided that it's best for this decision to be made on a case-by-case basis locally. So that's kind of the approach that they took. Additionally, some other countries, so like France, they've required masks on transport services, so like the metro system and stuff like that. Additionally, if they're out during rush hour or peak hours, they're going to need a certificate from their employer to prove that they're out for a good reason. A lot of these places in France and in other countries have, again, kind of delegated the responsibility down to the local level and said you can reopen what you want based on your cases specifically. So specifically here in the United States, we've seen that example, a little bit of that example at least. There's some responsibility down to the state. So a state can choose whether or not have a stay-at-home order in place, but the federal government does issue guidance as to what they believe is correct. So I think it's like the White House Coronavirus Task Force is like the formal name. They're the ones that issue any type of guidance. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is a little bit more with the Trump administration. A Pence staffer has now tested positive for coronavirus, but Pence continues to test negative. I think I did see a few days ago, maybe, that the president and the vice president are going to be tested very frequently. So it might have been every day, but they are going to be tested very frequently now that a lot of their staff are now getting coronavirus. So far, the United States has done 9 million tests since the pandemic erupted. And however, according to a Business Insider poll, like 5% of people who thought they had the disease were actually able to get tested. So it shows that even though people want to get tested, they're not able to find access to that. So that's been the goal of really every state government, or hopefully that's the goal of every state government, to make sure that enough tests are available so that people can get access to that and hopefully prevent the spread of that disease. More states are announcing phased plans to reopen. So the one that we're going to highlight here is Massachusetts. Massachusetts was almost kind of a surprise. As you remember, or might remember from like 2 slides ago, we said Massachusetts was in the top 3 for the most coronavirus cases, right? But they've now announced a phased plan to reopen. So that first phase is going to be START. So what they've said is they're going to look at industries where the workplaces naturally have little face-to-face communication. So that way they can kind of get their economy started back up, but it's not going to be anyone that's at risk, or those jobs really don't require face-to-face interaction anyway. The second, like, I guess, theme, they said it was phases, but it's more like adjectives, or like, I don't know, ways to describe stuff. So the second like part was cautious. So then they're gonna I guess just do more or open up more stuff that actually does require face-to-face. So that first phase was no face-to-face or limited face-to-face, and then now it's like slowly easing up. Then the next part is vigilant, and that's when they're loosening some more restrictions, and this all is contingent on the public health data showing that this is going to happen. Finally, the last stage is going to be the new normal. So the new normal is basically what we end up with, I guess. So still making sure that social distancing and stuff like that is happening, but hopefully working towards a vaccine and not permanent stay at home. The governor there said that the goal is to begin the process around next week, so May 18th. However, all non-essential businesses in that state have been closed since March 23rd. So it's been about 2 months, as it has been in most states at this point. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about really what our country looks like with social distancing. So as you can see, we don't have a super great grade on social distancing. So we're rated a D minus. Before, I think Nevada was the only state that even had an A or a B, and now they've dropped down to a C plus as well. Really what you're seeing now is that people have, I guess, realized that they're not going to get the disease. So they feel it's okay to go out. When in reality, really that community spread is still very much a thing and could impact people still, regardless of their age or background, especially if they have underlying conditions. All right, so the last slide before we transition into an election 2020 update is going to be some happy news. So during this stressful time, whether that be with exams or with all this stuff happening in the world, sometimes we can take a break to enjoy some happy news. So a restaurant, some pizza restaurant, they had like a burglary, but I guess it didn't work. But the restaurant, what they ended up doing was like they're gonna allow people to get food as long as they demonstrate some kind of need. So they're giving out free food even though there was like a burglary there. Another thing, for the first time, U.S. renewable energy has surpassed coal every day for an entire month. So if you've taken APES or like any other like environmental class, that's crazy just because of our high dependence on fossil fuels and all of these non-renewable resources. So for the first time, renewable energy sources have surpassed non-renewable. And finally, the last one that I thought was most interesting was an Alaskan town grocer was hailed as a hero after he sailed to Costco for groceries for his town in a 14-hour round trip. So apparently his like little town is isolated. You can only get there by flight or boat. But they've been impacted a lot just because no one can travel. So what he does is I think like takes orders throughout the week, and then he makes a 7-hour ride over to Juneau. Well, not ride, like a boat ride over to Juneau, which is the capital, I think. And then he gets the groceries, and then he comes back to his town with all of these groceries in his little like sailboat or ship. And that way he's able to provide for his town. So apparently his family has been owning this grocery store and like the gas station and stuff like that for years. So this is his way of giving back. So now we're going to move into the election 2020 update.
But before we do that,
enter stuff in the chat if you want. It's been
yeah,
very quiet.
yeah. But also, so we put up our poll, and as of now, only 4 people have voted in it. But 75% of people who voted, so 3 people, said that they felt, oh wow, okay, it immediately changed. But okay, so now about half of people said that they felt pretty good about the exam. Tell us why in the chat. Like, according to Twitter, there were a lot of different forums, and the memes aren't that great because of that. But tell us all about it. We'd love to hear it because we helped with the cram stream yesterday. So yeah. But with that, while you guys are telling us about how your exams went, so last week Brandon talked a little bit. Oh yeah, don't like tell us like what was on the forms or anything. Just to clarify, we don't want you to like lose your like scores. Just like generally, why did you feel what you felt? But Brandon last week talked a little bit about how a lot of states are moving towards mail-in voting, and how like the vast majority of people they favor having a mail-in election in November, and obviously that's because of the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so one state specifically, California, said that in November, every single registered voter would be getting a mail-in ballot. And so this is the first time in history that California is going to be doing something like this. But something that's even more important is the fact that because they're making this decision months in advance, they'll actually be able to like set up a system and infrastructure to make sure that every single voter will actually be able to get their ballot. Because you guys might remember we talked about a couple weeks ago how in Wisconsin, which decided to still have its Democratic primary, and like they tried to mail people their ballots, but like thousands of voters said that they didn't end up actually getting their ballots. It's really important to make sure that like if you're going to have a mail-in election, you have like the resources to get that done. So people actually get their ballots, they're actually able to vote and have their voices heard. And so like there also isn't a bunch of confusion in whether or not they'll have to go in person or how like they're going to get a hold of a ballot at the end of the day. But California is also going to be having in-person voting. And that's because Governor Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, said that some people just aren't comfortable with having mail-in ballots. And so I'm pretty sure we'll probably see that like a majority of voters, if they have mail-in ballots, like why wouldn't you mail it in instead of trying to like find your polling place? And so this is like a part of a huge trend that's happening like across the United States. Like Ohio also had its vote by mail primary last month. And so we're seeing that a bunch of these states are trying to make sure that they're able to minimize the amount of like contact people have with each other. And because thousands of people vote on election day and hundreds, I'm sure, at every single polling place, one of their initiatives to actually do this will be to get mail-in ballots happening. So Eric says, even if you vote on a mail-in ballot, you can drop it off at any polling place in the state just to be sure it won't be lost in the mail. And so, yeah, I'm pretty sure that might differ from state to state, but that's good to know if anyone is old enough to vote in the November election. And so one of the issues with Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, and other governors across the United States announcing that they're going to be moving towards mail-in ballots is that some Republicans have been claiming that voter fraud is going to be a huge issue, just because they say that because you're like mailing people their ballot, it's not as easy to verify their identity. And so they're like, oh, this is going to be a huge problem. The election's rigged, right? But the issue with that claim is that in the past, even though billions of people have voted, like with mail-in ballots, we've seen that the amount of voter fraud has been like less than like 1%. Like according to like studies that have been done, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than voter fraud is to happen. So it's important to remember that cases of voter fraud, they're actually very rare, especially because most, like actually pretty much all mail-in ballots, they have some kind of like verification on the form. So you might have to like put your driver's license number, or you might have to like put the last 4 digits of your social security number. So obviously election officials don't want voter fraud to happen. And they also make sure that there's like some kind of like thing to safeguard to make sure that voter fraud at the end of the day doesn't happen. And so that's important to keep in mind when you're hearing about like debates over whether or not we should be having a completely mail-in election in November. But on that note, Poland actually did have an election. Well, it kind of had an election because it had its like presidential election, right? So pretty much like our form of what's, if you're in America, our form of what's going to happen in November. And 0% of people turned out, which meant that there was technically an election happening, right? Like they were supposed to be having an election, but no polling sites were open. So nobody could actually go vote in the election. So like there was 0% turnout, which for an election is kind of like, that doesn't sound right. Because like even in Russia where like the elections are like literally rigged, there's still people who like go and vote. So that's important to keep in mind. So the reason why that happened, for some context, is that the ruling party, which is right now the Law and Justice Party, they were asked by like opposition parties to have the government declare a state of emergency or some kind of natural disaster state, so the election would be postponed. And so that's really important, right? Because it would allow like Poland to organize some kind of like mail-in election, which, as we're seeing, is a trend around the entire world. But that didn't happen because the Law and Justice Party leader, who is like in informal control of the government, refused to let that happen. And so the issue with this is not only that they had a presidential election with 0% turnout, but also in the past, the Law and Justice Party, they've been kind of like accused of trying to like erode democratic norms. So Poland obviously is incredibly, the people of Poland are kind of worried, like, what does this mean for democracy? Especially because there is a government in power that is like kind of in power because there was no turnout in its election. And so it's very likely we can expect to see that like this election and the results, which there aren't really any results, will probably like be challenged, and like people in Poland will probably try to like see how to get this fixed, because you can't exactly have an election and then have no one turn out and expect those results to be like respected. So on that note, because we're talking so much about mail-in ballots, let's talk about the Postal Service, which is like incredibly important infrastructure when it comes to mailing things around the United States. So the reason why you guys might have seen the Postal Service in the news in the last like few weeks is because in April, President Donald Trump said that he was going to veto any relief bill that included funds for the United States Postal Service. And this is because a lot of people say that the Postal Service is like this huge example of like an inefficient government and like pretty much just like burning money, right? And so that's because at the end of 2019, it had $160.9 billion in debt. And so the reason why this is, or part of the reason why this is because the United States Postal Service is required to prepay retiree and like benefits to its employees. And so a lot of like most public or private companies aren't required to do it, but also most government agencies, or a lot of them, also aren't required to prepay these retiree benefits. And so that's part of the reason why like the USPS is in this huge amount of debt, because it has to like make sure its employees are having their benefits, right? And so the issue with this is because even though the USPS has a lot of debt, it's an essential part of United States infrastructure for two main reasons. The first is because it delivers a lot of prescriptions to people in like rural areas. So 1.2 billion prescriptions in 2019 were delivered through the United States Postal Service, which means that especially when we're in a time like when there's a pandemic happening in the country and a lot of governments, state governments aren't doing a lot to like make sure social distancing norms are like respected, we might see more people trying to get their prescriptions through the mail. And if you have a prescription, think about it, like you might also have some kind of pre-existing condition that might like predispose you to like having more mortality or being more likely to face complications if you do get COVID. And so it's really important that through the Postal Service, people are able to actually get their medicine, right? And so on top of that, around 100% of the prescriptions that like the VA delivered were delivered through the Postal Service. So that pretty much means that like veterans are also pretty much relying on the Postal Service to get their meds. And so the second reason why like the Postal Service is really essential is because a lot of companies like Amazon, for example, rely on the USPS to do this thing called last mile, which is where if a package is being delivered to some kind of rural area where like Amazon doesn't want to spend money to like send its drivers, they'll like use the USPS to get those packages delivered. And so part of the reason why the USPS has all this debt is because it's not allowed to charge like really high rates to get that done, right? And so yeah, Brandon says the USPS over everything. Completely agree, because it's a really important part of United States infrastructure. Like people use it to get their mail, to get their prescriptions. And so right now, if you want to go buy some stamps, that'd be great. Might not make a huge difference, but you'll have stamps. And who doesn't like stamps? And on that note, make sure you're following all of our social media. We have a TikTok, which Brandon is actually the, like, we call him the chief TikTok officer of Fiveable. And we have a Twitter, Instagram, a YouTube channel. If you guys want to get access to like the cram charts, which are going to be incredibly useful, they're pretty much like a condensed version of everything you need to know, the main important stuff you need to know for every single AP exam. Those are going out on like Twitter and Instagram, so like you can get access to them there and like print them out.
They'll start like a thread on Twitter and it'll have all of like the resources for that exam.
Yeah. So I know like Gov went up yesterday. Brandon says he used it. But yeah, so resources are always being posted on like our social media. So that's a good place to like give a follow. It's good to know that you can like get access to these free resources so you can get a 5 on your exam, because that's what we're here to do.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great night, everyone. See you guys later.